All right, folks, welcome. I'm Charlie O'Donnell from nextNYC, and I have two really spectacular founders with me that I am lucky to have. Lindsay is here in New York today, and Ravi is in Singapore. Ravi, what time is it in Singapore right now?
It's 10:30 p.m.
Okay, so we appreciate whatever caffeine you needed to keep up the energy level at this time, and we'll make it punchy and concise and get everybody on their way in the middle of the workday. So why don't we start off with introductions? Lindsay, if we can get your quick background and what you're up to now.
Sure. Very briefly, currently I'm venture partner at Bullish, which is a consumer VC firm. Prior to joining VC, I probably most known as co-founder and chief brand officer of Chief, which is a women's executive network. We launched in 2018, grew to many members, hit unicorn status, and I remain on the board. Prior to Chief, I was one of the founding employees of Casper, the D2C mattress company. And before that, I was at a string of startups that were very hit and miss. And my background is in publishing.
Cool. And Ravi, thanks for joining us and being a sponsor of this series.
Thank you for having me. A quick background. I'm the CEO and co-founder of a company called Qapita, Qapita. We are a leading player in this part of the world, India, Southeast Asia, on cap tables, equity management in general, and also on secondaries. And we are expanding into the US market. Before starting Qapita, I was a banker by profession, largely working on fundraising.
You think so?
And for that was my profession, yeah, before becoming an entrepreneur.
Okay. So a lot of people don't realize this, but I've actually started a company, not to any kind of the success that either of you have reached. But when I started, I split my equity 50-50 with my co-founder because I thought that was going to be the signal that we're really kind of in this together. But what I realized is like no amount of equity was going to change the fact that it was like my idea. I'm the one who did the fundraising, and the equity split didn't really create the kind of ownership that I wanted it to do. And I think that's where a lot of founder agreements go wrong. It doesn't do what you hope it accomplishes. So let's just start from there is, what do you hope a good founder agreement accomplishes? What are the goals of the agreement that you have with your founder? And Lindsay, I'll ask you to start.
Sure. Well, I will say this. I think one of the most important things you could do as a founder is find somebody who, agreement aside, is committed and wants it and has a similar value set as you. And so no amount of going 50-50 or splitting it 60-40 because it was somebody's idea is going to change the fact that you either have a solid working relationship or you don't. I've seen plenty of founders who are 50-50 and one founder's truly carrying the other on the back. And I've seen founders who are 70-30 in it 50-50. And for whatever reason, they wanted to split it like that. So I think it really comes down to two things. One is finding somebody who is equally committed. And the second is knowing that equity it's not just like an early, oh, we're going to have an agreement. That's going to carry you through many rounds of dilution as well. And so I think as a founder, you need to be thinking through, what matters for you as you're finding a co-founder. And what feels fair, which is a word I always come back to, as you continue through the rounds of funding.
And Ravi, what about you? What did you aim for with your agreement, and what would you advise founders?
Most of my career as a banker, helping to either sell companies or find an exit for companies, or helping companies fundraise. I worked on cap tables basically on most of my professional career. And so many interesting cases with broken cap tables, shareholder or co-founder alignment being broken, and that doesn't necessarily help. So it comes back to one thing that Lindsay alluded to as well. What's the best thing for the business? And the principle that we used, I had 3 co-founders. We didn't have equal shareholdings when we started the business, and that was a very uncomfortable conversation to have very early. Even before we got started, when then the business was on a PowerPoint, back in the day when we used PowerPoint. And fair does not mean equal. It's as simple as that. And that's true for compensation, remuneration. That's true for equity as well. It had to be fair, and it has to be fair with keeping the business in mind. And then as long as it's fair, and fair and equal are two different things.
So, Ravi, I'm curious, with that amount of co-founders, what's the criteria for being a founder versus an early employee? I think that distinction carries a lot of weight. And so you had other people that you started your business with that you decided to call founders versus anything else. And you just paid them, not given them the title. What do you think is that right line that says, okay, now you're a founder?
So the first thing is, two parts to your question. What's a founder, and then there is what's a co-founder, right? So founder is, do you have the obsession and the ownership to see this through and through the ups and downs, and therefore there is no cushion, there's no scaffolding, and you're taking the entire risk and you're willing. I think the phrase is delayed gratification. Are you willing to be the last man or woman standing, a last person standing, in terms of if you think about a VC funded startup, there's liquidation preferences, all of those things. So you really have to believe in the idea and be prepared with that delayed gratification in terms of outcomes to actually, and be the last person standing when things hit the, when things don't really go well, and see the idea through. So that defines a founder from my perspective. And what forms a good co-founder? The criteria for us was simple. I was, like I said, I spent 1.5 decades working with founders, finding exits for their companies or selling businesses for them or raising capital for them. And so in the process, saw many of these cases play out. And when there is transactions in the business, either a capital raise or a merger or an acquisition, that's when the cap table and the conflicts on the cap table really play out. And so was able to see these from close quarters. And so having, from co-founders perspective, from business building, you needed the trust and respect and the shared value system that you have. But the one thing I wanted with my co-founders is the ability to be comfortable in having uncomfortable conversations, because you'll have many of those along the way. So I chose my co-founders with, where I had, there was a shared value system. They were obsessed about seeing this idea through, and that I was comfortable having really uncomfortable conversations with them, starting with them, because you're going to have many of those along the way.
So, Lindsay, in addition to being someone who you're willing to have uncomfortable conversations with, how do you see, you've been a founding employee, you've been a co-founder, you've sought a co-founder. What's that line? What's that division for you?
Well, I'll say this. When I was early at Casper, I really felt like a founder, and credit to the founders, because I think the best founders make every startup employee feel as they should. If you have a little bit of stake in the company, everybody should feel like a founder. Everybody should feel like they want impact and they want that startup to be a success, and they're a little delusional. So credit to the CEO and the founders of Casper. It really look back at the transition between early startup employee and co-founder as a real epiphany moment, because I truly thought, I was like, oh, I'm practically a founder. I was here pre-launch. I know exactly what's going on. I had no idea. There's a very big difference. There's just so much more pressure. And I use the word pressure and not stress, because I think there's more stress when you have less control. When you have more control and it's all riding on you, you get a little bit of less stress because you get to call the shots, but there's way more pressure. That's just a very nuanced, fundamental difference. And I love what you both talked about with the hard conversations. I remember one of my first disagreements with my co-founder. We were having an argument about something really stupid, like a debate. And she had a great idea. She said, let's come back tomorrow with 3 things we just need from one another. No, let's come back with one thing. Let's make it really simple. So we came back the next day, and she said to me, and this is very good feedback that I've gotten, I need you at the end of the day to just, like, when you're working on a project, and this was like business shit. She's like, I need you to sum it up for me. You're kind of all over the place. I'm very ADHD. I'm the creative one. Sum it up so I can just keep going. I'm more of an operator. I need you to think more and deliver to me more like an operator. I said, fine. She said, great. What do you need from me? And I said, I need you to be my friend. So cheesy. And that was a really big turning point in our relationship, because I really needed to make sure that we trusted each other the way and felt committed to each other like friends, or this wasn't going to work long term. And it did. And we remained friends, and she moved 4 blocks away from me, and we talk almost every day.
I really appreciate both of those perspectives. And in particular, the pressure versus stress thing, I think is really interesting. When you think about like the needs and what everybody's supposed to contribute, and Lindsay, I'll keep going with you for a moment here. When you think about business person versus creative person, or who has more relationships, how do you think about mapping splits to everybody's contribution? You sit down and you say, you bring this to the table, you bring this to the table. What is that uncomfortable conversation like? And how would you recommend founders figure out like what's worth what?
Yeah. That reminds me of another early conversation when it felt like there was very clear lines of who owned what. And then my co-founder said to me, okay, we're going to hire the head of sales that'll report into you. And I was like, whoa, I've never had sales report into me, like the revenue's under me. And there was this moment of, we hadn't discussed this. And both of us assumed the other person was going to own revenue. Probably the biggest thing one should discuss before entering into a partnership, like who owns the revenue number. And so the practical advice is map all of that out ahead of time, sit down with a hypothetical org chart and sit there and say, if we had a full C-suite, who's reporting into what? And don't leave any stone uncovered, because I think there are just obvious things that would feel obvious to you and your co-founder or co-founders that may not be obvious, that need to be discussed ahead of time. And by the way, she took over ownership of revenue and she was great at it. She was great at it.
Was that kind of a hot potato situation that you know, who or did she really want it?
You know what, to be fair, we ended up hiring a phenomenal person. So I think her operational ability was better at, you know, because we had such a stellar head of sales, it made more sense for it to report up into the CEO because it was revenue. And so really what came out of that, a good lesson was, if neither of us felt like that was our superpower, we better hire somebody amazing at it that could help round out our strengths and weaknesses.
So that's a really good segue to somebody who manages cap tables for a living. And you bring up Lindsay brought up the org chart. Ravi, how should I think about founder splits, especially as it relates to early org chart, and thinking about like, where is this equity going to go? Should it reside with me as a founder? Should we be budgeting some of this? Like some of those early conversations, how do they relate to equity?
Yeah. So, let me first do what Lindsay did, talk about my cap table first. And that was years of working on cap tables and deciding to build a software that helps manage cap tables. And this when you think about different markets, there's different levels of maturity as well in terms of understanding around cap tables and how these work. And so we had seen many situations where not having clear, a founder dynamic, founder transfers when someone decides to hang their boots midway along the journey, creating in deadwood equity on the cap table actually doesn't really help the business at the end of the day in terms of raising capital. So what we did with our own cap table was taking from all the lessons and having that conversation, who's bringing what to the table and who's owning what. So one of us owned the vision, product, the product vision, the vision for the business, and everything to do with external facing, which includes fundraising and investors and selling the story. One of us owned keeping us honest and narrow and running the operations and keeping process orientation, keeping everyone in honest. And the third one was coding. So would only be involved. And so that's how we had a CEO, a COO, and a CTO. And that's basically what each one of us brought to the table. And we all came from different backgrounds. One of us was a technologist, was building my entire career. I was a banker, I was working on cap tables, usually the external facing person and the spokesperson for the business at the end of the day, and responsible for raising capital and finding the first few customers. And then our COO, my third co-founder, was running operations and keep everyone honest, straight and narrow, build processes and systems that will help us scale once we have the initial few customers come in. And so we knew what role each one of us had to play in the business, and that's how we decided the equity. Well, what's more important is how the journey evolves. Like the roles can change along the way. Like, we didn't really define who owns the revenue, and we had to have that conversation somewhere along the way as well, because it didn't matter. First, you had to kind of in the first few customers, and so revenue wasn't even a metric until we found the product market fit. So first step was like, so along the way goals change, and therefore you have to be, like I said, and that's what I meant when I said be comfortable having those uncomfortable conversations along the way, who's owning what, and so on. The other dynamic to remember from a cap table perspective is dilution happens along the way, and therefore, ownership and ownership percentages change along the way, and therefore this had to be sustainable for each one of the co-founders. And the dynamic of how the VCs looked at the cap table, is the founder ownership enough to keep them motivated? At what point in time do we see the third aspect, which was important? And so we actually wrote down a co-founders agreement. What would happen if we had to visualize a scenario? It didn't actually play out, but what if one of the co-founders left midway along the journey? What would happen to that equity? And therefore some kind of intersay vesting or transfers to the remaining two co-founders or remaining co-founder, if that scenario played out. Now, it wasn't, the design was, for us to go on a long journey. We're 6 years and counting as we speak, but and we're all still building the business together. But we had to when it came to the co-founder agreement, which eventually got replaced by shareholders agreement once a VC funding came in, we had to figure out how we would run the business if someone, for whatever reason, was not able to go along the journey. And so there's implications to how investors looked at the cap table and the resilience of the cap table as you think about building through multiple funding rounds.
So I want to drill down on one thing about what you said, because you talked about like bringing these folks on and divvying up the equity up front. And if I'm a founder starting something and I'm looking to recruit co-founders, where do you think it makes sense for me to start? Is it like, I want to retain this, so this is my budget for founders? Is it more like, I think I'm going to need to give them this much for them to be willing to join? What's the right starting place for how much you might share with a co-founder? And then Lindsay, I'll hand that question to you as well.
Yeah, it really boils down to, can you build without that co-founder, and how much of the build journey gets shortened? Because by definition, if you're building a startup, you want to build something and you want to build it fast. That's a definition of a startup, especially if you're not starting a business, you're a startup. And the way I differentiate between the two is how fast are you planning to grow. And therefore the criteria in our case was, can we build without this person, and then does the person have the passion and the obsession to see through this journey for a long time? And this is documented. Average time to IPO is 10, 12 years now, and time to exits in the part of the world where we started building was 14, 15 years. And if that's what it takes to build a large business, this is as long as, this is the closest metaphor is a marriage. And therefore you have to find a person who's willing to go the entire distance with you. And so that was the definition of a co-founder. And is the journey significantly shortened? And then have that conversation saying, this is what I bring to the table, this is what I plan to build, this is what role I expect you to play, and this is how we split the equity. And so that's not an easy conversation. There's no right answer at that point in time when you're having the conversation. It's only right or wrong in hindsight. But we said, we'll take this call and then we'll stick with it. You can't get it numerically right perfectly, but the principles and the philosophy with which you divided that equity, and that's how that conversation plays out. Question is, actually it's a more important question for if that co-founder is a co-founder or not. And then if it is the right co-founder, you will figure out a way to have that conversation on the split of equity. And also signaling in terms of who's going to, from a VCs and investors perspective, who's calling the shots, what's the dynamic between the three, or in our case, 3 co-founders or 2 co-founders, who takes the decisions, what happens if there's a deadlock. Right. All of those have to be addressed while raising future rounds.
Right. Lindsay, how do you think about the starting position for that split? You pick up a co-founder, do you just assume 50-50 day one, or what are some like the first thing you think about in terms of how do I get to a number?
I think Ravi had great advice and probably more insight into this. It really depends. So I don't think there's like one size fits all advice for this. It really depends on, you know, has somebody been sitting with this idea for 2 years? How many co-founders do you need? Is it somebody who's leaving their job and coming in all in committed? There are times when somebody is waiting for a seed round so they could leave their job to make, a salary. Does that person deserve a little bit less because they're taking less risk? So it really depends on the situation. And it really depends on if you are the CEO or if you're the CEO, first founder, and you're thinking about this, how badly do you want that person? And how are you going to make it work so it feels fair for everyone?
One of the questions in the comments, and you alluded to this, is somebody coming in later as a co-founder, that we've seen this happen. Sometimes you see it actually either somebody comes in later or somebody
We
leaves
used to call that
early.
a faux founder back in the day. Remember, we used to call it a faux founder.
I remember that. I haven't heard that term in a long time. But the opposite sometimes too is somebody who starts early and then leaves, and how much they get credit. And one way that I've advised people to think about it is how much of the terminal value of this company has been created up until this point, and how much can this person change it? So for example, you think about like 4 university students get something off the ground, and then 2 of them decide to go back to school, and then 2 of them, sort of keep going. Those folks always want a lot of credit for being there at the beginning and starting. But the reality is, what percentage of the way to an IPO are you at that point is probably quite small. Actually, it's the reality of the situation.
Typically, that's why there is that vesting schedule, right? So I think thinking about that vesting schedule is also another tool you can use depending on how far along you are. I think there's typically a 4-year cliff, but if you are worried about that, if you think this is going to take longer, you could potentially extend that as another tool to allow somebody to have a greater share, but they would need a longer commitment.
There was a post that went around on LinkedIn yesterday that talked about a sort of 6 or 7 year cycle it was even like backweighted a little bit. To incentivize people to stay on longer. I thought it had to do with founders, but I don't know if it had to do with employees, but I thought it was just really interesting to get people who definitively want to opt into doing something longer. The other thing I would say too is the title does matter, and there is value in and of itself, right? Like it is helpful to somebody's career. One of my portfolio companies had an early designer. That design was important to the company, but the designer was relatively junior in the grand scheme of things and wasn't sort of a big operator. They gave him a co-founder title that I think helped his next thing, right? Ultimately, to be able to say, I'm a co-founder of this business, even if he only had a couple of points of equity. Titles are meaningful. Equity is meaningful. Ownership, where you are in the org structure is meaningful. And those could be 3 different things. They don't all have to do on lockstep. So let's talk about founders shifting around, changing roles. Lindsay, what advice would you have to founders and what they should think about when it comes time for somebody to say, I'd like my role to be different? Either they want to step up with something, they want to step down with something, they want to step out. In what ways can founder agreements sort of accommodate that and make that easier?
You know what? I think there's a very big difference between, stepping into a different role versus stepping away. Like those are 2 different conversations. Stepping away, I think Ravi probably would have more to say about that because you would be leaving, which that's a whole other topic. I think it's great when co-founders have deep commitment and know that their role and what they started as needs to flex and evolve. When you are a 2-person team versus a 10-person team versus a 100 or 1,000 person team, there is a very high likelihood you are not the same person and likely not in the right role. So I think having flexibility and being accommodating to evolution of the role is really essential and getting your ego out of it.
So Ravi, let's talk about, and I think these following questions that we'll wrap up with these two are really more in your sweet spot in terms of like how investors read into the founder structure. And what are some of the things that you're helping founders with that helps a company in terms of their founder structure be more investable or things are a little more buttoned up?
Yeah. So, some of the broken cap table situations we've seen is where there was, they didn't have founders agreements, and therefore there was some, what I would call dead founder equity on the cap table, which is basically a departed founder who's no longer involved in the business but has substantial portion of the equity and didn't help in future rounds and future fundraising because investors saw that as like non-contributing equity sitting on the cap table. So to avoid those situations, and this links back to the previous conversation with Lindsay, one is to have we not only had vesting, but if there was a scenario where founders left the cap table at some point in time, the unvested portion would go back to the remaining two founders, so they have enough equity in the game. And this early investors and VCs like this concept, and they extended that as well. So if any of us departed even after our funding rounds for whatever reason, then the remaining founders kind of had that equity. So there was no scenario in which the business suffered from, for whatever reason, some founder was not able to continue with the business. The second thing
just out of curiosity on that, is it typical that it would be evenly spread, or is it the kind of thing where like if I'm a more technically inclined founder and my CTO leaves, I'm now going to have to take on like more of the CTO role than the other founder. So maybe the split might not be even in terms of where that person's equity goes. Is that possible?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it depends on specific roles. And again, this is tailored. In our case, we said if there is a departing founder, then we were comfortable with the remaining founders getting that proportionate to their existing equity. So we had a total founder equity pool, and it would go back in proportion to others. And now that didn't play out, but we just gamed the scenario and said, let's just make sure the business works, even if one of us had to leave. And this was important because all of us were mid-career professionals starting out, and we were not, fresh out of college starting. We both all three of us were in our 40s when we started the business, and therefore it was important. Life happens, and therefore you may or may not be go along with the journey. That was one. Second was the vesting was actually a reverse vesting, or what's called a reverse vesting in this part of the world, which was effectively a clawback in case one of us left the business, and investors had that go back to the other two founders to help them continue to the business, or to recruit another co-founder if that scenario plays out. If we needed, like two of us were non-technical, one of us was technical. If the technical co-founder left, we had to effectively recruit a technical co-founder, and so we'll use that equity, and that will be a decision by if there was a board at that time, the board or the remaining two co-founders. So that was our founders agreement, and we kind of build this based on our understanding of cap tables and what we had seen. In terms of stepping, your question was what's the VC lens on this? I think VCs want to ensure there's enough skin in the game for everyone to remain motivated. I think that's the single most important factor. And so when we decided the founder equity, we also gamed outcomes in terms of, there's benchmarks around seed, series A, series B, what the dilutions are. So you can kind of get to a diluted cap table at the end of series B or series C, and then see where you end up with. In our case, we set the landmark as a series B and certain scale of the business. And we said after that, if a founder departs, yes, you've got to a certain milestone, so you've earned your equity. And by that time, the business should technically afford every employee in every role as a business, and for the business to be sustainable, and therefore everyone gets remunerated thereafter on market-based comps, or close enough to market-based comps, and market-based comp not necessarily from a cash perspective, but from a cash plus equity perspective. It's in line with the market, and therefore in line with what weight you're pulling in the business. And so after that vesting period, which was 4 or 5 years, then the business had to afford every role in the business as an individual contributor to the business, in addition to in terms of the role you're playing in the business. And so that was the best way to structure. And we had looked at several co-founder agreements and build it. Again, we've seen these play out in different businesses where especially businesses that struggle to raise because the continuing founder had not enough equity, and they hadn't actually solved for this early on, and didn't visualize a scenario where co-founder exited the business. So that was important.
Last question, and I want to handle a really good question in the comments where you have a founder who moves to a part-time role, or just somebody that you want to keep around because obviously they already have whatever equity they vested in the business. Have you seen scenarios where maybe a founder doesn't continue, but they are incentivized to still create value in the business in another way through maybe shifting from founder equity to advisor equity, to sort of keep whatever value they bring, but not necessarily on a full-time basis?
Yeah, two parts, two scenarios. Early stage, obviously you have to redistribute equity if you're and later stage, and you define that milestone in your co-founder agreement. So if you're vested and you're moving to a different role, then it's role based. By that time it should be role based, and that's when the business can sustain itself. And hopefully by that time you have actually got the business into a shape where it can, it's built sustainably. Like basically any person playing a particular role in the business is compensated like he would in any business of comparable size. And so that's basically, we define that as Series B in our co-founders agreement. But that could be, it could be milestone based and so on. So stepping away and stepping into a different role is it happens along the way, and by the time your the structure in which you're incentivized to play a role in the business is defined by the needs of the business by that time, and that's a way to build a sustainable long-term business in any case. And so the founders equity had a certain time window, and at the end of that time window you kind of move on to role-based incentives and compensation.
Gotcha. Listen, this has been super helpful. Thank you for sharing your knowledge, and really appreciate that Qapita is now providing an alternative to US-based companies in the market, starting from other parts of the world and bringing your services here. What's the best way for a founder who's curious about your cap table software to get started or reach out?
Yeah, Ravi at Qapita.com is the best way to reach me. I'm also on LinkedIn. Thanks for having us on this webinar, Ali, and I've seen different conversations with great interest, and yeah, happy to engage with anyone. Just shoot me an email at ravi@qapita.com. My co-founders moved to the US. It's going to be based in the Bay Area. We have a sizable team now in the US and ready to engage anyone who's interested. Happy to help, even if it's just a conversation. Happy to have that conversation.
Cool. Thank you so much.